So I guess an opening question to sort of trace the iterations of Afrofuturism since its inception in the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s. I've been thinking about the past, present, and future of the term and the movement, especially since we have so many people represented who are currently historicizing the work and making interventions that will then be taken up in scholarship for years to come. What is Afrofuturism? What are its defining features, its characteristics?
Well, I guess starting in the spirit of the panel where we talked about the past, I think in its early formation, I came to the conclusion recently, you almost can't look at a year, you've got to look at a bracket of time, like say from 1987 to 92, 93. And one of the things, I read an article that Barber wrote in the late 80s, it was called The Race for Theory. And in that article, she talks about how, as a black feminist or as a black cultural critic, it seemed that what would later become cultural critics, or what was coming into popularity at the time, that black scholars or people of color had a lack of access to try and develop a certain theoretical perspective as the Cold War is ending and people are clearly nowhere in a new era. You got, during this 5-year period, Berlin Wall comes down, people are starting to use desktop computers, you got sky pagers that they call them at the time. For me, as a person who was involved with promoting hip-hop shows, and this, what we always call the golden age of hip-hop, late 80s to early 90s, and so clearly it was at a different cultural moment that was emerging. You had the appearance of Donna Haraway's work with the idea of the cyborg coming into play. You had Malefi Asante's the Afrocentric idea, an idea of Kemet. So what you're really experiencing at that time from the late 80s to early 90s is what I would call either a fragmentation or a disaggregation of knowledge, and people are kind of in a race to come up with an idea to describe what's happening. And one of the things that I think what Mark was trying to do when he was describing this phenomenon in relation to what these artists were doing was try to explain what is this intersection of race, technology, and artwork that's going on at the time. Now, one of the things that as a later researcher I discovered, there was a person I'd written about in the 70s talking about black speculative literature by a guy named, I think his name was Pfeiffer, talking about how science fiction and black speculative thought have always kind of gone on parallel tracks since roughly the 19th century, where to be unfree and write about freedom, that was science fiction, okay, in terms of being able to speculatively imagine a utopia where you are free from bondage. That was the equivalent of science fiction or speculative thought, even though it was not necessarily categorized as such. And of course, science fiction had always been characterized as a subgenre within English lit, as something not worthy of scholarly investigation. So I think when you get people, like for instance, I've argued that in the black speculative tradition, really the first major breakthrough you probably get with Martin Delaney's work in the 19th century with Huts. Even though some people could argue that some of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry could be thought of as a speculative idea of the speculative sacred, in terms of the relationship between being unfree and being able to become an angel, or whatever, depending on how you work with that. I think at that stage of Afrofuturism, I look at, there are 3 works at the time that I think are important reads. After Flame Wars, I think you got to look at Kelly Tao's piece that talks about, if you understand and read W.B. Du Bois' work on the souls of black folk, that really is a work that really lends itself from a cultural lens to understand postmodernity for black people in terms of dealing with the cultural disorientation of being a person of the African diaspora in the West. Then I think the next significant piece after that is probably Kodwo Ishian's book, paper, Further Considerations, which really kind of does an outline of Afrofuturity and some of the themes that he believes are special at the time. However, I think what we would call the first wave of Afrofuturism, Paul Miller talks about in his book, The Book of Ice. The first wave of Afrofuturism, what it was missing a core philosophical perspective to really organize around, and it didn't have a critical mass of scholars at that time to really promote the idea and develop it further. And I'll share the mic.
The term emerges at a moment when cyberpunk is romanticizing the bricoleur, right? So William Gibson, in several of his short stories and in his novel Neuromancer, says the street finds its own uses for things. But he uses street in this very white sense. There's no sense of the historical synonymizing of street and black urban culture in his writing, right? And so he's romanticizing punk roboticists like survival research laboratories and hackers who are presumed to be overwhelmingly white. Well, I read that phrase and I thought, yes, of course the street finds its own uses for things. That's the historical story of being black in America as I understand it. And yet, at this moment in time in the early 90s, when this word emerges and this discourse starts to emerge, you have the official narratives of the emerging technoculture being constructed by the house organs of that, what is at that point a subculture, which are Wired magazine, Mondo 2000, the early electronic bulletin board, The Well. They're overwhelmingly white, they're overwhelmingly libertarian, they're steeped in Ayn Rand. They loathe the world, the flesh, and the devil. They dream of sloughing off the corruptible flesh, etherealizing the mind, uploading it into a massively parallel mainframe, and fleeing this burnt hunk of clinker that we call Earth for the off-world colonies, right? It's a deeply body-phobic vision of futurity and of technology shot through with a loathing for the corporeal, the feminine, and the other. And that's really problematic to me. And so there's a deep, deep political heart to Afrofuturism that I worry is getting lost. And when I see writing about it that begins by defining it as an aesthetic, I find that highly problematic, because aestheticizing is the first step to depoliticizing. Now, I love aesthetics, right? But aesthetics as politics is the cornerstone of fascism. That's what Walter Benjamin says in The Mass Ornament. And the Third Reich, which has never been more popular than it is at our moment, right? Unhappily, and people shouting Heil Trump. You can't make this stuff up. Talk about living in a science fictional reality, right? And so the Third Reich and fascism, National Socialism, is nothing less than the aestheticizing of politics, right? And as Benjamin says, the contemplation of our own destruction as an aesthetic experience of the first order. So I think we have to be mindful of this. We have to push back against the aestheticizing of Afrofuturism. I promised you incoherence, and there it is.
No, that was great. As an art historian, it's hard for me to hear that aesthetics can't be politics. But I'll leave that alone for now, especially with regard to a conversation about that's working at the intersection between race, gender, and sexuality. A lot of times black aesthetics has functioned as black politics, but I'll leave that, we can pick that up later if anybody wants to. But for now, I want to keep going with something that you said, Sheree, about Black joy and Black health and these kinds of, what exactly are the Black futures that we are imagining with Afrofuturism? And what is the Afro in Afrofuturism? So, yes, and please read that beautiful paper that you prepared for us as the writer on the panel.
This is 25 years in a 400-year-long song. I'm going to try to skip through it where I can. But we live in a world of ever-evolving new technology. Mass communication connects us theoretically to every curve of our world, and yet there is increased voicelessness. This supposed silence belies a more sinister, ancient agenda, one that has plagued us through the centuries since the first ships left with stolen lives. A force pursues us relentlessly, like the sharks that follow the scent of our ancestors' blood. There is blood in the water, so much blood, and yet the salt and the years have created an illusion. A more accurate term for it, its name would be erasure. We create we create, and yet external forces rush to reclaim, rename, reappropriate the culture and the intellectual labor we give birth to. But our art is our sword and our shield. And our art is a vital tool, a mold and form of critical reflection and rejuvenation, capable of responding to and addressing the paradox of oppression and the joys and the wonders of living. That is what art does. When valued, protected, and shared across the generations in all of our communities, honoring all of our multiple shared identities, our art has the power to subvert and resist erasure, to resist silencing, to resist being co-opted for other agendas that have little to do with Black love, Black joy, Black liberation and freedom, health and wholeness. When we determine our way forward, rooted in our own creativity and values, those that would distort and exploit us and our creativity, they become fiercely and transparently uncomfortable with the enterprise. They're not interested in Black love, Black joy, Black health. They're interested in the aesthetics of it. And maybe that's a different conversation of it. Oh, look at them, they're dancing. Oh, look at them, they're singing, they're weaving, they're rapping, they're doing all this amazing stuff. What does that have to do with Black future in terms of our ability to be healthy and whole in this present, not in some theoretical abstract future, but right now? So I'm at a place now very different than where I was in the 90s, very different when I was with Paul Miller and Alondra Nelson and Callie Tal and others on the Afrofuturism.net listserv. Thank you, Mark, for the name. Where I was just trying to find my tribe. I was trying to find other people who were interested in that weird stuff, you know what I mean? I was looking through my father's albums. I was looking through the Schomburg Library and just doing the research. I'm at a place now where I've done the dance, I have sang the songs, I've raised millennials, and I'm at the point where I want to see that art and work being connected actively, consciously with the political work and the activism that I see happening on a grassroots level to try to address the same oppressive systems that we've been facing in the country for centuries. We're like on this merry-go-round where, you know, there's the Harlem Renaissance, there's all these renaissances that take place periodically, and then they get stumped back down. You know what I mean? They get stumped back down. And so for me, I want more out of my futurism. I want more out of my futurism. I want more out of my futurism. That's where I am. So I just gave you a little bit.
Oh, wow. Man, I was so caught up in that. I was going to repeat that question you had, Tiffany, again about...
The question is, so last question was, what is the Afro and Afrofuturism?
I remember talking about this at the Astro Blackness conference a couple years ago. I was like, look, if there's no Africa in your Afrofuturism, you're doing somebody else's futurism, you know? One of the things I also remember stating that I thought that on the continent, and perhaps even the Caribbean, that part of what I call the ecosystem of people of African descent would do more with it than those of us that live in North America. Because I said in North America, they would primarily probably get into it trying to use it as a literary thing to get tenure, write some cute stuff, to prove themselves to be accepted by the establishment. You know, and as Mark said earlier, depoliticize it to a certain extent, making it look more like Tomorrowland rather than trying to complete the decolonization project. You know, one of the things that when I lectured about it and talked about it in Accra, Ghana a few years ago, people abroad are taking the idea very seriously in terms of, in Nnedi Okorafor's work, I think she refers to herself sometimes as a magical futurist. And I talked about it in the manifesto I wrote last year about using the Black Speculative Art Movement as like an umbrella for people that come at it from different points of inquiry, whether they're an Afro-surrealist or an Afrofuturist or a Black quantum futurist in terms of how they deal with time. And it still comes back to that philosophical core where I know Marimba Ani in her book Yurugu talks about this concept of future time in terms of we're snatched out of one temporality and put into someone else's future time, which is predominantly Judeo-Christian, which has a different type of end time or eschatology that they deal with, and now that is all coming into question. And so I think that and I argued recently, I think we're at a phase now with 2.0 where I think in the book, the volume that we put out last year, we kind of laid down our markers in terms of dealing with metaphysics, applied science, programmatic spaces, and other themes like that. This goes beyond literary and aesthetics. And I would disagree slightly with Mark. Aesthetics can be political when it's pointing out a direction of maybe where you should be looking. And so it can be very political, but it depends on sometimes access, you know, where, who is, what is the price of your ticket, you know, as James Baldwin would have said, in terms of somebody like coming to our BSAM events and scouting a person that we want them to say a certain thing to massage it for mainstream consumption. And that's why I think a lot of us, when we saw our recent, I won't name the author or the paper, but some of us are aware of how it was kind of defined in the popular press recently in one of the New York papers. We were kind of horrified with the characterization of it, and it kind of fit with what you were talking about as a simple aesthetic consumption by putting in a few performers and not the serious ideas that are involved with it, and not the intellectual work or rigor that's really under dealing with a lot of what we're working on at the present time. But I think it's grown beyond, as I argued recently, this is a Pan-African project now. It just depends on which language you're talking in. As one of the arguments I've made, and I talk about people who are interested in Afrofuturism also need to be aware of future studies. What's that about? Some of the work that Lonnie Brooks does with the idea of Afrofuture types, using science to project where are we going to be in 500 years. If you go back 100 years ago in the Encyclopedia Britannica, I believe it said that they believed that black people in America were going to be extinct. Okay, and of course that turned out not to be true, but I think it was dealing with, as Sheree alluded to, our health conditions at the time. I believe 115 years ago, at the time, there were some scholars saying because of disease and other issues, there were more black Americans dying than being born because of our health conditions at the time. And so, when we talk about future time, as was recently published in Sheree's book Obsidian, this idea of Sankofaration, looking back to look forward. Other cultures do this. For instance, I know in the Jewish tradition, they look into their deep history to make sense of some of the issues they have in their own contemporary problems. So they also do that in China with their politics. They'll go back and look at something to get a strategic understanding of how to deal with the geopolitical situation. I was thinking about something that, what you were saying, how of terms of history being rubbed out. I don't know so much sure about that, because then when you politicize it, as you look at the features of people who call themselves African Americans, we didn't get through all these different shades and complexion by accident. Now, I believe in police they call that DNA evidence for a crime. Okay, so we know that something happened, but we, in public American education, they're just not comfortable being truthful about it, because the American project can't stand difference that much. I mean, they're fighting over bathrooms, fighting over, you know, they thought religion was a big thing. So Afrofuturism is a necessary project to see where, for the American or African socio-political imagination, in terms of giving you a compass of being able to forecast what you need to do to take care of your family, your community, and the broader region or area that you live in and exist in. So it's very, very necessary.
Should I? Well, first of all, I don't want to be remembered as the man who tried to kill aesthetics dead and beat on it. So let me nuance that position just slightly. I think I've been somewhat misunderstood. So in my own defense, I well understand that aesthetics can be highly political, and not just when art is agitprop, but that it can be part of the warp and woof of politicized or political subculture at an almost molecular level. I also understand that art is always already politicized. It's steeped in the ideologies and politics of its historical moment and its cultural embeddedness. But what I was referring to is specifically aesthetics in consumer capitalism, because that's what consumer capitalism does. It eviscerates meaning, it flays the skin of things, taxidermies it, and then resells it to us at Hot Topic as a transgressive lifestyle statement, right? And that's what it does. And then it becomes lockstep rebellion, you know, a trillion nonconformists all marching, you know, to the same drum, okay? And so that's what's so pernicious about consumer capitalism, is it takes the skin of the thing, but not the essence of the thing. And that's really what I was inveighing against. So I'm absolutely well briefed on the politics of art, and especially in Black culture. But there was one point I was going to add too, which is just one of the things. First of all, how many people have read the essay in which I coined the term Afrofuturism, Black to the Future? So a few of you, okay. I wonder if I could bore the audience with just a very brief passage from that for those who are unfamiliar with it, because there are some aspects of the formulation that I think are important and worth sort of citing chapter and verse very briefly. So simply put, I ask, why do so few African Americans write science fiction? And then the reason that that question has to have its point sharpened, in my opinion, is because that state of affairs at this moment, which was 1992, when Samuel Delany, Steve Barnes, and Octavia Butler were, to the best of my knowledge, the only African Americans writing SF. The reason that I wanted to formulate that question, and it seems so urgently important to me, is because it was utterly counterintuitive to me that that would be the case. And the reason it was counterintuitive was, as I said, science fiction is a genre whose close encounters with the other, the stranger in a strange land, would seem uniquely suited to the concerns of African American novelists. It's the absence of Black SF writers is especially perplexing in light of the fact that African Americans, in a very real sense, are the descendants of alien abductees, that they inhabit a sci-fi nightmare in which unseen but no less impassable force fields of intolerance and institutionalized racism frustrate their movements. Official histories undo what has been done, and technology is so often brought to bear on Black bodies, branding, forced sterilization, Tuskegee tasers come readily to mind. And so it's this idea of stories that can be both liberatory and repressive, and a kind of a subversive semiotics that can undo them. And in the moment we live in, storytelling really does cage the mind. It always has. What was it that, was it Sojourner Truth who said, or Harriet Tubman, I freed 1,000 slaves, I could have freed 1,000 more if they had only known that they were slaves, right? So this idea of culture as a contest of stories, a war of narratives, is tremendously important. And right now we're bearing witness to stories that are unfounded on fact, pernicious fables that have real consequences in people's lives. And so science fiction, speculative fiction, was important because our visions of things to come bound our avenues of escape from the here and now, as well as erasing the past. And also adopting a science fictional worldview affords a kind of a Marcuse-like fruitful alienation from the world around us that allows us to see precisely how alien American society really is. So it's an as-if, that speculative, magical, realist perspective where you imagine that your historical moment is science fictional, as it always already is, and that produces philosophical and political insights. So it was an engine, in my opinion, that would drive those insights.
I just want to say, we're in this conversation, when people ask questions, why aren't there Usually the answer is there are. You just don't know them. And also not only, because even at the time when Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany were publishing, Jewel Gomez was also publishing, Wanda Coleman was also publishing, Ishmael Reed was also publishing, Amira Baraka was also publishing. There are other writers that I don't have access to my library right now, but if I just pull them out, excuse me? Henry Dumas. I mean, there are so many writers, but this is the thing that's left out of those conversations, the system and the politics of it, the publishing. I worked in publishing. If you're not being published, are you writing? If you're not being published, are you writing? If the 10 people at the table who decide the 55,000 books that get printed each year in English in this country, only they believe in the force, there can be only one. There can be only one at a time, and that's the one that their one black friend tells them about, or what have you. Then are the others publishing? Are the others writing? Do independent bookstores, independent publishers, small presses, do they count when they're publishing these other writers? So for me, the conversations are important and great to have, but I'm always questioning, like, well, who are you talking to? Where are you reading? I was a bookseller as well. I worked, in bookstores, independent black bookstores, where we published, where we sold some of the independent comics that could not get distribution from the others. They were still creating the work, and they were doing work that, the only one that I saw that got mainstream was Static, but there were others, Mega 7 and other works that were out. And the question is, if you're not being anointed by the mainstream, does it count? And I think that's a conversation that's really important now, especially with all these independent creators now. And it's actually more technologically easier and less expensive to create and publish on your own. It doesn't have the same stigma as it did in the early 90s and other, places. And especially since people find out that you can go to a big press and still not get widely distributed, or they're not necessarily going to help you do a lot of promotion. They expect you to do that on your own anyway, as a mid-list author or not. So people are like, I could do this myself, because I am doing this partially myself. But I guess my question is, there's so many writers that we could have been having that conversation with at that time, and they would have been very surprised to know that they didn't read or write science fiction. So in these conversations, we always have to talk about the mechanics of it, the publishing industry, the distribution, the networks, the way that we get information about each other, about these other writers, and how that's part of the erasure as well. That's not by accident. We're still having the same conversations in book publishing. Why aren't there more diverse forces that we were having in the 90s? It's 2017. It's 2017, and we're still having conversations about this. And Octavia Butler wanted to do an anthology of black science fiction before Dark Matter, and she was told by publishers that there was no market for it, that no one would read it, no one would want to, and she was going to do it with Martin Greenberg, who already had published many anthologies at that point. So the question is, we have to be more nuanced about the question and be aware that when we see absence or when we think there's invisibility, there's more going on than that. And we have to look outside the places that are anointed, the places that are canonized, to find out where the richness is. And that's why I love our culture, because we always have to work outside of the mainstream anyway. It's why we create jazz and we create other, art forms, get tired of them, move on, create something else, and keep going, because we're always creating work that gets kind of marginalized in the first place. So you have to be innovative. So I just want to say that, because I hear that, and I know you wrote that then in 1992, but it's just like, there are so many other people that were doing work.
Absolutely.
Charles Saunders, I'm sorry, I can't walk off this panel and not mention Charles Saunders. Or Stephen Barnes, who were publishing in the 80s.
Yes.
And Mary Aldridge as well, So
yes.
there are other people.
Thank you so much. But last question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the idea that we need to be a little bit more attentive, we need to have a certain level of skepticism, even pessimism maybe. But so the question is about limits and possibilities, and what are the limits and possibilities of Afrofuturism as, I hear critiques of it as, well, it's too narrowly about the African American experience. It's too narrowly about the black experience. And then alternately, Afrofuturism has been taken up in very multicultural contexts, Latin America, Asia, the Arab world. So just wondering about the limits and possibility of...
One of the things I would just say for students I've made the argument, and I know, and I was in dialogue with someone last year. If I'm talking about a critique of Black futurity, I don't need the Frankfurt School to make my argument or critique, because frequently the Frankfurt School was anti-Black in a lot of its cultural formations, and so, and anti-jazz when you get to Adorno. So I'm like, I kick the Frankfurt School totally to the curb when it talks, and that has to deal with the idea of agency. The Frankfurt School was not pro-Black agency. I think they had their own internal politics at the time, which was related maybe to a disappointment in socialism at the time. And I always recommend people, and you see this argument whether it's with Plekhanov's book, Art and Social Life, and others. So, because so many people, especially graduate students and all, they're just going to teach what the person in the classroom taught them, and a lot of American theorists are enamored still with the French a generation later. I don't know why. And so they're going to just parrot what their professor said and thinking they're onto something, when there's a whole lot of material out there surrounding African philosophy, African American philosophy, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, whether it's Sylvia Wynter, whether it's Du Bois's work and Ryland Rabaka's work with Du Bois, to form a critical understanding and politicizing this this Black futurist project. The other thing is, and it is growing beyond, I think that's why I said the first wave was very American-centric, but it's moving beyond that the last several years, because that's what the 2.0 project's been about. We have Black folks from Germany contributing to it in terms of they having this African-European network forming now. And I think right now, in the current moment, a lot of times artists, because in an American context, when you wrestle between this idea of art for art's sake, my perspective is we don't have the luxury of art for art's sake at this moment. You know, when you're talking about the new Jim Crow and all this other stuff, you know, if you want to do it, that's fine. I'm not saying an artist can't do it, but you know what, that's some stuff you have the freedom and luxury to do. I'm just saying most of us don't have that luxury to do something just to be doing it. All right, the other aspect of the politicization of art going forward, what's going to be driving it now, and it really started a few years ago. I didn't have to have the Council of Foreign Relations tell me that globally we're in a neo-nationalist moment at the moment. And that neo-nationalist moment is not being driven because people suddenly got racist. What has happened is that people are disappointed in the ability of the state, especially in the left, to deliver what they said it would deliver. And that's really why a lot of people, some of the people that voted for Obama last time voted for Trump. It wasn't because they hate, a lot of it is not because they hate other people of color, it's because a lot of times what they call neoliberals, left, some of the pseudo-left would always get people like us sitting in this room to go vote Democrat, and in return for this, what was the mantra of the 90s? If you play by the rules, all this will be added unto you. And at the same time, then Bill Clinton, who's like the father of the new Jim Crow, along with his wife. I know this will hurt some people from New York, but a lot of young Black people in the Midwest, when it came time to vote last year, they were watching Anna DuVernay's documentary, The 13th. And in The 13th, you see Hillary Clinton's picture, along with Donald Trump. And so they would look at him like, these are all the same people. So in a way, I was glad young Black people didn't listen last fall. And the Democrats got the defeat they richly deserved. And so I think going forward, if you're talking about in near future Black futurity, we have an opening now to reassess our relationship with democratic politics in terms of what we expect to be delivered, in terms of very material, because a lot of times Afrofuturity, and as Mark alluded to, we don't have to, this is where the aesthetics part becomes a problem, you know, where they're going to send, like all the movie stars they send to get you to go vote, and they don't talk about how they represent neoliberal capitalism and access for themselves, but to the regular person on the block, they didn't do anything for them. And that's all what Ferguson was about. Ferguson really called into question, the Ferguson unrest, social justice and the socio-political imagination in this country. I know I was an eyewitness to seeing how the aspirations and struggles of predominantly poor Black underclass people were their vision was hijacked by people that came from outside of the St. Louis region, who were little more than grant hustlers, a lot of them. When these young black people kept this struggle alive literally for the first 30 days of Ferguson, and then you get all these people showing up outward that because they had access to media, kind of took their voice away from them. And that's why one of the arguments I make, if the political right is responsible for trickle-down economics, the political left is responsible for trickle-down ideology. And one of the things, one of the young black people that came back, that have been some of my students, because Mike Brown's uncle was in my class that semester, when they come back, they've been hit by rubber bullets, tear gas, and that stuff. They come back, Dr. Anderson, what is this intersectionality stuff? I thought we were fighting the police. And that was where I had that moment of, when you're in the midst of a struggle, you don't have the time to read a big, thick book to understand these theoretical connections. If you can't have it make sense of, this has helped me gonna pay my bills, this is gonna help me stay out of jail, this is how we can do this, that, and the other. You know, because they were not engaged with theory. These young people were, their theory was coming from practice in terms of figuring out how to struggle against the police and other political issues. Because it was the Democratic Party that ended that movement. It wasn't the Republicans. It was the U.S. Senator, Democrat, the prosecutor for the case, Democrat. And that story has not emerged of how the Democratic Party prevented that struggle related to Ferguson, that then came to the Eric Garner situation in New York and then Baltimore. That was the Democratic Party that was afraid of that becoming something that they couldn't control at the time, not the Republican Party. And that still needs to be talked about in terms of future politics domestically. And at the time it intersects with other cultures, because at the time we were getting social media at the time from Palestinian young people, and that's when it reoccurred that the same tear gas they use on Palestinians that they used on people in Ferguson is manufactured by the same company. You know, a multinational company manufactured the same tear gas, and I'm going to be talking about that next week in Israel, which I'm sure some people will not be happy about this idea of these multinational corporations using the same stuff to hit us over the head with. And I'm saying that as a Cold War veteran of the Marine Corps. I remember talking to another veteran down at the protest. I never thought I would see the U.S. military used to suppress its citizens the way it did. And the language they used for the activists in Ferguson was, this is a counterinsurgency, like this was Iraq. You know, and that's where I wrote a piece and an essay at the time talking about the way they kept us in the black neighborhoods and all that was the same way they do the Palestinians in Gaza, except there wasn't a wall yet. But they found a way, and that's why, and they don't talk about the other intersection of how valuable hackers were in terms of impacting local communications at the time, which is why they then had to call in the National Guard. And I've stated publicly, I was glad the kids burned stuff down at the time, because they caused so much disorder. It forced the National Guard to come back in there, and once you activate a National Guard, that means you have to clear that with the White House. It becomes a federal problem. And to me, I think to his eternal shame, Obama never showed up at that time, and that's why I think a lot of the young people there were really through with him after that. So there's this young grassroots groundswell that's not listening to what these people are putting in front of us on TV, you know.
I just want to say that we're having these conversations over here, but in the continent of Africa, in the motherland, they're having many, many conversations amongst themselves. And as I forget who said it, but they're saying Afrofuturism begins with Africa. And they are self-determining themselves what that means for them in their individual countries, in their languages, in their own languages, many, many languages, and they are publishing, creating that work independently and also with some of the presses there. So if you look, you will find that since in the past 25 years, there has been an amazing amount of growth and discussion in festivals, film festivals, literary festivals. They don't include just Nadia Okorafor. There are many other writers that I'm struggling right now to keep up with and catch up and learn and figure out, you know, what their different styles are. So there's a lot happening in Africa right now, on the continent of Africa, and it's not just South Africa as well. Thank you.
Question? Yes. Great. So I just want to repeat the question. Is about the African diaspora in Latin America, how that figures into Afrofuturism, and also when we talk about Blackness in America, how can we start to bridge the idea that Blackness and Latinidad are not so separate, and how does that figure into us thinking about our futures together? Is that okay? Great.
Okay. Informally, I think it's about what people see and what people claim. So if the conversation is going to be greater and more, it's going to come from Afro-Latinos who are doing that work. It's not going to necessarily come from me, an African American from Memphis, Tennessee. It's going to come from Afro-Latinos. The other thing I want to say, this is just very informal, so I don't want anyone to get offended, but you know, I'm probably going to get offended because I just said that, disclaimer, is that if you're not claiming your Blackness, then how am I supposed to know that you're Black? That's one. You know, I lived in New York, so I know, but there's a lot of swerving and curving going on. I'm just gonna say, so let's be real, all right? So I'm not gonna spend a lot of energy personally trying to write your history if you are barely even acknowledging that you're my sister. That's one. I'm not saying you personally, but let's be real about this now. People claim Black when it's convenient. It's mostly inconvenient. Okay, in this paradigm, in this culture. That's another thing. The other thing is there's a lot of great stuff that's happening. I thought Junot Diaz was Dominican. I thought he was. I thought he was doing speculative fiction. I thought he was, but I thought he got a Pulitzer Prize, right? I thought he did. I mean, that's just one, I know. But then there's all these other amazing writers. Bill Campbell, Rosarium Press has an amazing roster of writers, and he's looking for more work. And then there's a beautiful anthology of, I think it's Cosmos Latina? Cosmos Latinos. Thank you. Those editors did a lot of hard work, and I'm sure they're continuing to do that work. There's Daniel Jose Older, you know, and his sister Malka Older. I mean, that's a force to be reckoned with, that family. I mean, so these are just people I can just throw out there. Victor Laval, I mean, Tony Medina.
I would say that Daniel, I don't think that Daniel Jose Older says that he's Afro-Latino.
He doesn't. He says he's Cuban American, I believe. But he makes a lot, he puts the world in his stories. He puts the world in his stories, I'll say that. What people necessarily walk around and identify as, that's a whole nother conversation. I'm just saying there's a lot happening. And that's just here. Let us go to, when you start looking at the individual countries, going into Central America, going to South America, and if you're blessed to work with translators, I just had one of my science fiction stories, The Dragon Can't Dance, which published in Gelada, which is an African publication, and in Harvard's Transition. It's just been translated on the 18th into Spanish, in Spain, by 2709 Books. So, I mean, there's a whole nother audience that, you know, you're going to be encountering, and hopefully they'll be publishing their own, like, local writers. But, I mean, there's a lot there. So I just want to say it's a complicated question. You're absolutely right, but I'm not going to do that work. You got to do the work. I did the work for Dark Matter. Somebody else step up, do your work. Get it acknowledged in your own networks. You know, don't wait to be anointed by the mainstream. Don't wait for Mark to write a piece on you. Get out there and do the work. And I mean, I know people are doing the work. Build community. These are great opportunities. The Black Speculative Art Movement is moving across the country. We're in cities everywhere. They're in Toronto. They're going to, can I say? They're going to Ghana next year. Join us. He's going to Israel. Hopefully he'll be able to look across that, you know, that border into Palestine and, you know, make some connections there. But we're doing the work, and I'm here. I help people. You ask me, I'm going to help you. So I probably need to say no more. But I help people when they ask me. So just reach out.
I agree with you. In our follow-up volume, actually, there is a piece of work. I have one of the contributors here of art. It's called, was it Afrofuturista? Soul Rebel is producing that artwork, and the Puerto Rican artist Enrique Carrion is dealing with the concept of Afrofuturismo in the second volume that's coming out. I'm also dealing with Natasha Kelly, who's an Afro-German. She deals with an Afro-culture critique, Afro-culture with a K, critique as it means to be a Black European in the diaspora doing this. And I have a contribution in the second volume coming out from the African French Senegalese writer Souleymane Ba, who's from Senegal. So it's all coming. That's why one of the writers from my first volume, Tobias Van Veen, always called, last year he started calling me like the Morpheus of Afrofuturism. I'm finding everybody from around the world who was doing this stuff in isolation, and I'm finding them and just bring them on, as Sheree said, finding them and bring them on in and growing the network. And Sheree's absolutely right. Depending on which part of the world you're in, like I remember my first time when I went to Cuba, I had a different picture of Cuba before than when I went. In this country, Cuba until recently is portrayed predominantly as white folk, and I went to Havana, I was like, damn, there's a lot of, you know, I met a bunch of black folk at the airport, this black Cuban officer, and they thought I was Puerto Rican because they saw my first name, Reynaldo, and I said, no, I'm from America, bruh. And then, you know, we went to this region where this city, Santiago, man, that's like East St. Louis, you know, in terms of, I think Afro-Latinos, and I'm still learning more about it, they've had their own problem with white supremacy and Latin culture that used to be denied until recently, I think, in the interest of maybe some other issues. And so there's a huge black cultural movement in Latin America now that's even bigger than the one in North America right now. And they're really getting more towards traditional African spiritual forms than people in North America are, especially in Brazil. And so there's going to be a big eruption of that stuff coming forward very, very soon. I won't be surprised. I mean, and then when you say Afro-Latino, like in the Afro-Caribbean, a lot of them, they get their inspiration from a Nalo Hopkins, who was a forerunner, and there are other writers in the Afro-Caribbean tradition. And then I think some of it deals with language. It seems that, I can't remember, it was one, in a piece that was written on black speculative literature back in the 70s, the writer Mark Pfeiffer talks about a lot of this black speculative thought seeming to be predominant in the English-speaking world. Like, for instance, in Africa, the people who seem to be at the forefront of Afrofuturism are from the Anglophone African countries like Kenya, where you get Pomsey comes up out of there, or Ghana, or now Nigeria, South Africa. But then that overlooks people like the Francophone Cameroonian film director Jean-Pierre Bokolo and his work that's been out for some time. So I think they're just those linguistic barriers that they're coming across, but it's like we're now, as Sheree said, we're starting to coalesce. And so, yeah, we're welcoming that. You'll see the Afro-Latino perspective in the second volume called the Black Speculative Art Movement, which will be out later this year. So that perspective is coming. You know, when I went and looked for it, but as Sheree said, I'm not going to write that. Y'all are going to write it. You know, so, you know.
We'll send a boost. We'll send a boost.
Okay, how many more questions do we have out there? I see one in the back. Is that the last one? Okay, last question, sir. Great, thank you. So what was your name? Last name again? I can't hear when other people are talking. Jeff Campbell? Carroll. Got it. Jeff Carroll. And Mama in the front? Rebecca, last name? Garcia. Rebecca Garcia. Look out for them. Search their writings. Look at their, Carol's table. But the question is about, what I think I heard the question to be about was, one, black satire and the role of imagination in mitigating these issues of anti-blackness and health conditions, and how the role of writing can actually be a liberatory practice. I think that's the question.
It's about black joy too.
Oh. I think, were you here from the beginning? Yeah. Oh, okay. You know, I mean, no, I'm saying aesthetics is important. I mean, the thing is, to me, and it crystallized for me, and this project really kind of started when I presented my work overseas in Paris first, and it led to the exhibition we had last year in the Schomburg called Unveiling Visions, which I think some of the local people here attended. And in dialogue with the artist John Jennings, I was talking about, before you can become free, you have to imagine it first, okay? Because if you activate your imagination socio-politically, even if the technology doesn't exist, you'll create it. Because the thing is, H.G. Wells wrote about rocket ships generations before they built them. And so the thing is, I want us to tap our imagination, because some people might be terrified. How does our imagination work in the absence of these oppressive forms? And I always ask people that question me when I've had some hostile audiences about, why do you all need Afrofuturism? I said, well, what is it about America that made Sun Ra say, I got to go to Saturn? Or why Nyla Hopkins is writing Midnight Robert saying we got to get our own planet to get away from this oppressive situation? That's probably what they ought to be self-critical about first. And this idea of the speculative, it goes back into setting up maroon societies, whether they're in Jamaica and other places, where we wanted peace and the ability to raise people outside of a hostile environment. And so that speculative thought is what you're really tapping into, what you're describing. And of course aesthetics is involved with that. I know I'm old enough, and a few other people, man, I remember those dope Earth, Wind, and Fire covers of the 70s. That used to be how you attracted people to buy something, was an album cover. Like, I thought that the jazz musicians had some of the best album covers, like The Heliocentric World of Sun Ra, Earth, Wind, and Fire, Parliament Funkadelic, in terms of, so aesthetics is very important. And you don't have to be so serious all the time. It can be fun, but even with fun and humor, there are politics involved, because that's where joy comes involved. We don't have to be sad all the time with Black futurity, or dealing, because a lot of time that idea of laughing in the face of tragedy is a part of our culture. So yeah, I agree with you.
Could I dive in very quickly? Just very, very quickly, I have a very dialectical mind, so much so that sometimes I'm often the antithesis to my own thesis in the same breath. And so to reverse my earlier course about aesthetics, it seems to me that sometimes aesthetics is just politics by other means, right? So we always have to remember, to the gentleman in the back, whose comment I'm very grateful for, but just respectfully, I don't believe there is such a thing as pure escapism. I believe that everything is soaked through with politics and ideology. So for example, you mentioned sort of the utopian vision of life on a desert atoll, or classically Robinson Crusoe. Look at something like The Martian with Matt Damon. I kept waiting for Friday to materialize, right? Because it's nothing but Robinson Crusoe on Mars. But the blackness in the movie is the vilified disco that he listens to, that is left behind by the woman who helped save him, right? And so that's a very odd gloss on the Robinson Crusoe myth. That subtext comes bubbling up through the music, which is sort of demonized in a strange way. So you could view that as a purely escapist vehicle, and yet it plays into all these prepper, white survivalist compound narratives of the rugged individual, this social atom who dreams of starting over. And it's like straight out of the Turner Diaries and all these other kind of racist mythologies of the guy who's, able to start on a planet that's been purged of otherness and diversity. Now, okay, maybe that's a kind of hysterical overreading, but of course all the best readings are overreadings, and Barth teaches us that all readings are overreadings anyway. So I just wanted to say that. But the other thing too is, you're talking about album cover art as a form of speculative fiction, and also just as a rich locus, a kind of a ferment of mythology. And that's absolutely true. It goes back to this question of aesthetics, which is we have to look for speculative fictions and Afrofuturism in other places than literature. So there's a whole discourse being enacted at the level of the cover of Bitches Brew, and the cover of, and that artist who did that and did all of those album covers and prog rock album covers, like the Osibisa album covers in the 1970s. That is a species of speculative speculative fiction. That is science fiction by another name, but it's being enacted at, it's sort of hidden in plain sight as surface, and therefore doesn't register as SF. And also just because of its blackness, in the same way that Richard Ellison's Invisible Man is, irony of ironies, kind of invisible as science fiction because it's by a black guy about black people, and yet it's totally science fictional. The main character is a hacker who hacks into the grid and steals the power to turn turntables. He's like the first turntablist. So you can reread and perversely misread and read against the grain, as Barth would say, these texts that don't register as speculative fiction, but in all the essentials are.
And I just want Sheree to give us the last word as the spec fic writer on the panel about the role of imagination.
Our imagination requires the laughter and the joy as well. So when we're talking about aesthetics, it's not to say that you don't have joy in the work. It's just don't let the conversation be only about the surface aesthetics. Don't let it just be about album covers. Oh look, there's space people on the album cover. You know, that's the kind of scholarship, or I won't even say scholarship, that's the kind of reportage that I've been seeing over the past 25 years to some extent that I find a little bit, I just find it a little bit dismissive about what else is going on there. And I think because it makes people feel comfortable. It's easier to talk about fashion and hairstyles and aesthetics and the cool, fun, shiny things than the things that inspire it. The things that make it required, you know, the things that we need to survive, you know. So that's part of it. It's a way of closing the conversation. And the other thing is, I talk that this idea of visibility is part of the reason why my books were called Dark Matter. I was talking about that we're hidden in plain sight. We have a force on the culture that has an impact almost on everything, even in a fun, like little fun Arnold Schwarzenegger moment, you know, movie or what have you, that's supposed to be set in space, it's supposed to be a comedy, and yet there's all these other things that are being played out over and over again. I talk about Ralph Ellison in my introduction to Dark Matter, which is called Looking at the Invisible. That the work, his body, his black body, was so race that that the science fictional element of his work, the experimentation of his work, was overlooked in a way that it might not have been had someone else written it, you know. So, I mean, there's a lot of complexity in that, but you know, it's about the joy, it's about acknowledging, it's about experiments of joy, and it's about acknowledging that we're fully human, and being part of human is, it's not just the struggle, but it's not just the struggle, it's not just surviving, it's thriving. It's thriving, and I guess that's what I want to see as part of the discussions of futurism as well.
Thank you so much. Please visit the tables, everything else. Join me in thanking our panelists. This was amazing.